They're recording this now because, well, I'm 92 years old, and there aren't many of us left who remember what it was like back then. Back when things were made by hand, when you knew the man who made your boots, when a skill wasn't something you learned from a book, but something that passed from father to son, like an inheritance you couldn't see, but could feel in your hands. I was born in 1870, right here in Pennsylvania. My father was Silas Hartman, and he was a wheelwright. That's a word most folks today don't even know anymore. He made wheels, wagon wheels, cart wheels, the kind that held up under 1,000 miles of dirt roads and rocky mountain passes. It wasn't just carpentry. It was an art, really, though my father would have boxed my ears if he heard me call it that. To him it was work, plain and simple, the kind of work that kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. Our shop was attached to the house, just a door from the kitchen straight into where he worked. I remember the smell more than anything else, that thick scent of fresh-cut oak and ash, mixed with the sharp tang of the iron tires he'd heat and fit onto the wooden wheels. Even now, 80-some years later, if I close my eyes, I can smell that workshop. Sawdust on the floor, wood shavings curled up like ribbons, and in the corner, the forge glowing red when he needed to work metal. My mother, Clara, she'd call us for supper, and we'd come in with wood dust in our hair and under our fingernails. She never complained, just set the table and made sure there was enough stew or cornbread to fill us up. We weren't poor, exactly, but we weren't wealthy either. We were what you'd call respectable working folk. My father had a reputation in 3 counties for wheels that didn't crack, didn't wobble, didn't fail you when you needed them most. I was the oldest of 4 children, the only boy. That meant something back then. It meant the trade would come to me, had to come to me, because that's how it worked. My sisters, they'd marry and take their husbands' names, but I'd carry on the Hartman name and the Hartman craft. I understood that even before I understood what it really meant, you know? It was just the way of things. I must have been, 7 or 8 years old when I first really paid attention to what my father was doing. Before that, I was just a child playing in the sawdust, making little towers out of wood scraps while he worked. But around that age, something shifted. I started watching his hands. The way he'd run his palm, along a spoke to feel for imperfections you couldn't see with your eyes. The way he'd test the curve of a rim by some measurement that lived in his muscles, not on any ruler. He didn't talk much while he worked. That's important for you to understand. My father wasn't a chatty man. He'd go hours in that shop with maybe 10 words spoken, all of them necessary, none of them wasted. So I learned to watch, to pay attention to what his hands were doing, because that's where the real conversation happened. In 1880, the spring of that year, I turned 10 years old, and that's when everything changed. It was a Monday morning. I remember that clear because my mother had just finished the washing, and the clothes were hanging on the line outside, flapping in the April wind. I was eating breakfast, cornmeal mush with a little molasses, when my father looked across the table at me and said, "You're coming to work with me today, Thomas. For real this time." That's all he said. No ceremony, no big announcement. Just those words, and I knew my childhood had ended right there, between one spoonful and the next. I followed him into the shop, like I'd done 1,000 times before, but this time felt different. He didn't let me wander off to play in the sawdust pile. Instead, he pointed to a stool near his workbench and said, "Sit there. Watch. Don't talk unless I ask you something." So I sat, and I watched, and for the first 3 days, that's all I did. Just watched his hands. The way he'd select a piece of ash, run his fingers along the grain, reject it, pick up another. The way he'd mark measurements with a piece of charcoal, not a pencil, because charcoal brushed off clean when you needed to adjust. The way he'd test the weight of his hammer before each strike, like he was having a conversation with it. On the fourth day, he handed me a spokeshave. It's a tool for smoothing wood, shaping it, and it had belonged to his father before him. The handles were worn smooth from decades of use, dark from the oil of hands long dead. Start with this scrap piece, he told me. Follow the grain, light pressure. Let the tool do the work, not your muscles. I gripped that spokeshave like my life depended on it and dragged it across the wood. It caught, dug in, tore up a chunk of grain. My father didn't say anything, just reached over, repositioned my hands, adjusted my angle, and nodded for me to try again. I must have ruined a dozen pieces of scrap wood that first week. My hands blistered, and the blisters broke, then they calloused over. My father never told me I was doing well, but he also never told me to stop, and I learned that silence was his version of approval. When I finally managed to shave a spoke smooth enough that he ran his hand over it without stopping, without frowning, I felt something in my chest I'd never felt before. Pride, I guess, but deeper than that. Purpose, maybe. The lessons came in pieces, scattered across weeks and months. How to read wood, how to know if it would split or hold. How to joint pieces so tight you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. How to steam wood until it bent without breaking. How to fit an iron tire onto a wheel so perfectly that when it cooled and contracted, the whole wheel sang like a bell when you struck it. He'd demonstrate once, maybe twice if I was lucky, and then I was expected to know it. I'm not going to hold your hand through this, he said one afternoon when I asked him to show me again how to calculate the circumference for a tire. You'll remember better if you figure it out yourself. He was right about that. The things I struggled with, the things I had to puzzle through on my own, those stuck with me. But God, it was hard. There were days I wanted to throw the tools across the room. Days when my back ached from bending over the workbench. Days when I'd catch myself staring out the window at other boys playing stickball in the street and wondering why I had to be in here covered in sawdust while they were out there. But I never said any of that out loud. You didn't complain back then. You just did what needed doing. By the time I turned 11, I could make a spoke from start to finish without supervision. It wasn't pretty, not like my father's work, but it was solid. It would hold. And in our trade, that's what mattered most. The real test came about a year and a half into my apprenticeship in the fall of 1881. A man named Cyrus Wendell came into the shop, a farmer from about 15 miles north, and he needed a full set of wheels for his freight wagon. 4 wheels, heavy duty, because he hauled grain and sometimes timber. My father took the commission, shook hands on it, promised them in 3 weeks. What I didn't know, what he didn't tell me until 2 days later, was that he'd been having trouble with his right hand. Some kind of stiffness in the joints, arthritis maybe, though we didn't use that word back then. He just called it, getting old, and tried to work through it. He started the first wheel himself, got the hub turned and fitted, but when it came time to shape the spokes, he handed me the drop knife and said, "These are yours to do." All 24 of them. I stood there holding that knife, feeling the weight of it, and I knew this wasn't practice anymore. This was real work, work that a customer was paying for, work that had the Hartman name attached to it. If I ruined these spokes, we'd have to buy more ash, and that would eat into the profit, maybe turn the whole job into a loss. My hands started sweating right there in the cool autumn air. I took my time with those spokes, more time than my father would have taken, but I was careful. Each one had to be identical to the others, had to taper just right, had to fit into the hub mortise perfectly. I worked on them for 6 days straight, coming into the shop before breakfast and staying until my mother called me in for supper. My father watched for the first day, then seemed satisfied enough to let me work alone, though I'd catch him glancing over from whatever he was doing, checking my progress without saying a word about it. The mistake happened on the 18th spoke. I was tired. I'll admit that. My eyes were starting to blur from the close work, and I misjudged the angle of the chalk knife. It slipped, dug in deep, and took off too much wood from one side. The spoke was ruined, unbalanced, worthless. I stood there staring at it, this piece of ash that had taken me most of a day to shape, now good for nothing but kindling. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel tears starting to well up, which made me angry because I was 12 years old and too old to cry over a piece of wood. My father walked over, didn't say anything at first, just picked up the ruined spoke and turned it in his hands. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You know what you did wrong?" I nodded, couldn't quite trust my voice. "Then make another one," he said, "and make it right this time." We all ruin pieces, Thomas. The difference between a craftsman and a fool is what you do after you ruin it. He tossed the spoke into the scrap pile and went back to his work. And that was the end of it. No lecture, no punishment, just the expectation that I'd fix my own mistake. I made that 19th spoke perfect. It took me a day and a half, and I checked it 100 times before I called it finished, but when I fitted it into the hub, it slid home like it was meant to be there all along. The remaining spokes went easier after that, like something had unlocked in my hands, some understanding that hadn't been there before. When all 4 wheels were finished, fitted with their iron tires and hung up for Mr. Wendell to inspect, my father rolled one of them out into the yard, spun it on its axle, and listened to it. That's how you knew if a wheel was true, by the sound it made when it spun, whether it hummed smooth or wobbled with a funk, funk, funk of imbalance. This one hummed like a hymn, and my father nodded once, just once, but I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not quite a smile, but close. Satisfaction, maybe, or recognition. Mr. Wendell picked up those wheels on a Tuesday afternoon, loaded them onto his old wagon with the help of his eldest son, and paid my father in cash $28 for the set. My father counted it out, put 25 in his strong box, and handed me 3 silver dollars. "Your cut," he said. "You earned it." Those were the first $3 I ever made with my own hands, and I kept one of those silver dollars for 60 years, until my youngest granddaughter talked me into letting her have it for a school project. I wonder sometimes where it ended up. The world started changing faster than we could keep up with, right around 1885 or 86. I was about 15, 16 years old by then, could make a complete wheel by myself, from raw timber to finished product, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about the trade. That's when the first factory-made wheels started showing up in town, brought in by train from somewhere back east, Philadelphia maybe, or New York. They were mass-produced, stamped out by machines in quantities my father couldn't even imagine, and they sold for less than half what we charged for a handmade wheel. I remember the day Mr. Gantry from the general store came into our shop with a catalog, one of those thick books with drawings and prices for everything under the sun. He opened it to a page showing wagon wheels, pointed to the numbers, and said, "Silas, I can order these for $7 apiece." "You're charging me 14. My father didn't even look at the catalog. He just kept planing the piece of wood he was working on and said, "And order them, Harold. See how long they last you." Mr. Gantry left without ordering anything that day, but I could see him thinking about it, doing the arithmetic in his head. 7 versus 14. 7 versus 14. My father never spoke badly about those factory wheels, not directly, but I'd watch him sometimes pick up pieces that had broken, wheels that had split or cracked after just a few months of use, and he'd run his fingers over the wood and shake his head. "Green lumber," he'd mutter. "They don't even let it season proper. Just cut it, shape it, ship it out before it's had time to dry right." He was right about that. Those early factory wheels, they were cheap, but they didn't hold up. Problem was, they were so cheap that a farmer could afford to replace them twice and still come out ahead compared to buying one of ours. The railroads changed things too, though not in ways we expected at first. More trains meant more freight moving by rail instead of wagon, which meant fewer wagons on the roads, which meant fewer wheels needed. At the same time, the roads themselves were starting to improve. The county started laying down gravel, then some streets in town got brick pavement, and wheels didn't take the beating they used to on those old dirt tracks that turned to mud every spring and froze into ruts every winter. Better roads meant wheels lasted longer, which meant people bought fewer of them. It's funny how progress works sometimes, how one improvement can undercut a whole way of making a living. My father adapted, or tried to. He started taking on other work, repair jobs mostly, fixing broken furniture, building cabinets, anything that needed skilled woodworking. But his heart wasn't in it the same way. You could see it in how he moved through the shop, a little slower, a little less certain about what the future held. He never complained, never said out loud that the trade was dying, but I knew he felt it. We'd go days sometimes without a wheel order, or before we'd had a waiting list of customers. I was young enough that I thought maybe I could ride it out, that things would stabilize, that there'd always be a need for quality handmade wheels. My father knew better. One evening, must have been 1887 or so, he sat me down after supper and said, "Thomas, you've learned the craft good, as any man could teach you. But you need to think about what comes next, what you'll do when there's no more wheelwrighting to be done." I didn't want to hear it, got defensive, said something about how there'd always be wagons, there'd always be wheels needed. He just looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "Maybe, but maybe not the kind we make." My father died in 1893. He was 61 years old, which seemed ancient to me then, but seems young to me now. The arthritis that had started in his right hand had spread through his whole body by the end, and there were days he couldn't grip a hammer, couldn't turn a chisel, couldn't do the work that had defined his entire life. I ran the shop myself for the last year of his life, and he'd sit in the corner on a stool, watching me work, occasionally telling me to adjust an angle or check a measurement. The day before he died, he watched me finish a wheel for a doctor's buggy, one of the last orders we'd get, and he said, "You do good work, Thomas." Better than mine in some ways? I told him that wasn't true, but he waved his hand like he was brushing away my protest. "It is true," he said. "You listened better than I did at your age. You paid attention." Those were just about the last words he spoke to me. I kept the shop open for another 5 years after he passed, but the work kept dwindling. By 1898, I was doing more carpentry than wheelwrighting, and by 1900, I'd closed the shop completely and taken a job at the lumber mill on the edge of town. It paid steady wages, which was more than I could say for trying to compete with factory wheels and automobiles that were starting to appear on the streets. Yes, automobiles. Hard to believe now, but we thought they were a passing fad back then, too expensive and unreliable to ever replace horses. We were all about that, just like we were wrong about a lot of things. But here's what I've learned after carrying these memories for 80-some years. The craft itself, the wheelwrighting, that died out like my father knew it would. There aren't 5 men left in this whole country who could make a proper wagon wheel from scratch the way we did. But what my father taught me when I was 10 years old, it went deeper than just shaping wood. He taught me to pay attention, to let the material tell you what it wants to be, to take pride in work, even when nobody's watching, to fix your mistakes instead of hiding them, to measure twice and cut once, because wood doesn't forgive carelessness. Those lessons, I carried them into every job I've had since. The lumber mill, the furniture factory I worked at during the Depression, Even the small repair jobs I still do sometimes in my garage when my hands aren't too stiff. My own son, he never learned wheelwrighting. How could he? There was nothing to learn by the time he came along. He became an engineer, works with steel and concrete now, building bridges. But I see my father in him sometimes, in how he checks his calculations, in how he won't cut corners even when nobody would notice, in how he takes responsibility when something goes wrong. That's the inheritance that matters, not the craft itself, but the character the craft built into us. The shop is long gone now, torn down to make room for a parking lot in 1932. Sometimes I drive past where it used to be, and I can almost smell the sawdust, almost hear the ring of hammer on anvil, almost see my father's hands testing the curve of a rim by touch alone. They're recording this interview now because someone thinks it matters to remember these things, and maybe it does. Not because wheelwrighting was important, but because the way a father teaches his son to work, to think, to take pride in doing something right even when it's hard, that never goes out of style. That's worth remembering. That's worth passing down.